These are the muscles of the head and neck. First, we're going to look at muscles of facial expression. If we look at these orbicular muscles, which are circular, we can see that there's this muscle around the mouth, which is called the orbicularis oris. And then here's another muscle that circles the eye, and that is called the orbicularis oculi. There's also another muscle that, of facial expression that helps you to lift your eyebrows, and it extends all the way from the frontal bone on the front and all the way around to the occipital bone on the back. So this is the occipitofrontalis muscle, all the way from the front to the back. Now on the front we can see the actual muscle tissue. It's orange, so that is actually the frontal belly of the occipitofrontalis muscle. And then there's this big flat tendon which we call an aponeurosis, and at the end of that aponeurosis is another small segment of muscle. We can just see the orange muscle tissue here, and that is the occipital belly of the occipitofrontalis muscle. Next we're going to look at muscles of mastication, and there's only two muscles of mastication that you need to know. If we look again at the head, and we're going to look at this side first. It's a little deeper. We can see this muscle that's sort of in a seashell shape. That is called the temporalis muscle, and that will help to move the jaw during chewing. If we go a little bit more superficial in the jaw area, we see another muscle right here that's vertical, and that muscle is called the masseter muscle, and that also is a very strong muscle involved in mastication, which is chewing. Another muscle that's found on the anterior part of the neck is called the sternocleidomastoid muscle. It's a long name. This muscle has its origin on the sternum and the clavicle, and then that's why it's called sternocleido, and then will extend up and insert into the mastoid process, which is found right behind the ear. So this muscle is called the sternocleidomastoid muscle, otherwise known as the SCM muscle. Okay, the erector spinae and the quadratus lumborum muscles you will find on a diagram. Although we will see the quadratus lumborum on a diagram, we can also see the quadratus lumborum muscle on this spine model. The quadratus lumborum extends from the iliac crest and then attaches into each of the spinous processes of the lumbar spine. So this muscle is called the quadratus lumborum muscle. This is the chest plate of the muscle man. And on the chest plate, we can see some muscles in the thoracic region. We're first going to look at the muscles in between the ribs. And there are two sets of muscles. We have the internal costal muscles, costal means ribs, and external costal muscles. It's easy to see that this one is more external because it's more superficial. But another way that we can look at this is by looking at the direction of the fibers in which way they run. The external fibers for the external costal muscle will run as though he was putting his hands in a pocket in his chest. And the internal fibers of the internal costal muscles will run the exact opposite direction. So these are the directions for internal costal muscles. These are the directions for the external costal muscle fibers. We can also see on this model some abdominal muscles. The abdominal muscles are in the abdominal region. We can see the first one is the rectus abdominis. It's a straight muscle that runs all the way down the chest plate, and we can see that on both sides. There are some tendons that run in between this muscle, and there's one long tendon that runs down the middle of that muscle, and that is called the linea alba, or white line. If we go a little deeper to the rectus abdominis, we can see the external abdominal oblique and the internal abdominal oblique. Now, because these muscles are not right next to each other, it's harder to see which ones which one is external and which one is internal. So this time we do need to look at the orientation of the muscle fiber. Again, these are the external abdominal oblique muscles because their fibers run in the direction of if this person were putting their hands in their pocket. Whereas the internal abdominal muscles are going to run in the exact opposite direction, not as though he was putting his hands in his pocket. The other muscles that you can see on the anterior part of this chest plate are the pectoralis minor muscles. These are the pectoralis minor muscles. They are attaching to each of the ribs, the top ribs. And the muscle that overlies the pectoralis minor muscle is the pectoralis major muscle. And so this side over here is showing a much more superficial view. This side is showing a deeper view. This is the pectoralis major muscle. And if we took that off, we would be able to see the pectoralis minor muscle. Another muscle that we see on this side, which is a little bit deeper, is called the serratus anterior muscle. And so we can see the serrated muscle fibers as they attach to each of the lower rib cage. That is the serratus anterior muscle that will also attach to the posterior aspect of the body. So again, this is the pectoralis minor, and these are the muscle fibers of the serratus anterior. The serratus anterior will insert anteriorly onto the ribs. Okay, this is the diaphragm muscle. If we take a look at it, we can see that it has muscle surrounding a central tendon. And the diaphragm muscle on your exam will probably be removed. Once we remove the diaphragm, we can see the diaphragm muscle fibers and where they've been cut to remove that diaphragm. So it could be, the diaphragm could be tagged on these muscle fibers on the posterior aspect of the chest plate. These are muscles that position the pectoral girdle. We start out with the levator scapula muscle. Levator and scapula will insert on the scapula. Next we have the rhomboid muscles. This is the rhomboid minor and the rhomboid major, but together they're collectively known as the rhomboid group, so we'll call them the rhomboids. We have this large diamond-shaped trapezius muscle that attaches at the skull, comes down to the spine of the scapula and down to the lumbar spine, and then it would continue on the opposite side in the same direction up to the spine of the scapula and up to the skull. So we'd get this large diamond-shaped muscle. We only see this muscle on the more superficial side of the model, so this is the trapezius muscle in here. Next we see some muscles that move the arm. We have the deltoid muscle that also attaches to the spine of the scapula and then down to the humerus. Lastly, we have the latissimus dorsi. It's a very large muscle group that attaches to the spinous processes of the lumbar spine, and they also, those fibers will come up and insert onto the humerus. So we can see this large muscle as it's extending its way all the way around to the front and inserting on the humerus.